Have you ever felt it? That moment, maybe years ago, when prayer felt like breathing, when you could not imagine skipping Mass, when the rosary beads moved through your fingers like something alive, when the name of God came to your lips before any other word in the morning. And then, quietly, without any dramatic decision, without any single day you could point to, something changed. The fire was still there, somewhere, but it was buried. Daily life had piled itself on top of it, one small thing at a time, until what was once a flame had become an ember so dim you sometimes forgot it was there at all. This is exactly what Padre Pio saw happening in the souls that came to him. Not the dramatic falls, not the great sins that shake a life apart, the slow ones, the invisible ones, the drift that happens inside the most ordinary Tuesday of your life, when the alarm goes off and prayer is the first thing you skip. Not because you reject God, but because the meeting starts at 8 and the kids need breakfast, and by the time you sit down to breathe, it is already 10 at night, and all you can do is close your eyes. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina watched this happen across 5 decades of confession at the Church of Santa Maria delle Grazie in San Giovanni Rotondo in the southern Italian region of Foggia. From 1918, the year the stigmata appeared on his hands, until 1968, the year he died, he heard confessions for an average of 10 to 15 hours a day. Some sources from the friary record days that stretched to 18 hours. Thousands of people passed through that wooden confessional. And among all the sins they brought, the one that grieved him most was not the violent kind. It was the quiet replacement. The moment when a person's first love for God had been slowly, gently, almost tenderly displaced by everything else life offered. He called it, in conversations recorded by his spiritual director, Father Agostino of San Marco in La Mise, the most dangerous wound of the soul, precisely because it does not bleed. If you value documented and deeply sourced Catholic history like this, subscribe right now. It is the best way to support this work. And drop a comment telling us what city you're listening from. We read every single one. This script draws directly from 2 extraordinary sources. The first is the 4-volume collection of Padre Pio's letters published as the Epistolario, edited by Father Melchiorre of Pobladura and Father Alessandro of Ripabotone, published by the Edizioni Padre Pio da Pietrelcina in 1971. Not a popular biography, but the raw, unedited personal correspondence of the man himself. The second is the testimonies compiled in the Cause of Beatification, formally titled the Positio Super Virtutibus, submitted to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome in 1997. These are sworn testimonies. These are legal depositions. Now back to the story. Padre Pio was born on May 25th, 1881, in Pietrelcina, a small hilltop town in the province of Benevento in the Campania region of southern Italy. Population at the time, roughly 2,000. He was baptized the same day and given the name Francesco. His family, the Forgionis, were poor farmers. His father Orazio crossed the Atlantic twice, sailing to the United States in 1999 and again in 1903 to work as a laborer in order to fund his son's education in the Franciscan Capuchin order. The sacrifice was enormous and specific. Orazio worked in New York City, sent money back across 3,500 miles of ocean so that Francesco could study theology in Morcone. Francesco entered the novitiate in 1903. He was ordained a priest on August 10, 1910, at the Cathedral of Benevento by Archbishop Paolo Schinosi. He was 29 years old. He had already been experiencing visions, locutions, and what he described in letters as violent physical attacks from what he believed to be demonic forces. And these are not metaphors. He wrote to Father Agostino in January of 1912, "The night before last was a true night of hell. That evil creature beat me terribly, and if the Lord had not strengthened me, I believe I would have died." These were not the writings of a man performing mysticism for an audience. These letters were private. He begged his spiritual directors to burn them. Many were preserved only because Father Agostino kept them against Pio's explicit wishes. The stigmata appeared on September 20th, 1918, in the choir loft of the Church of Santa Maria delle Grazie. He was 31 years old. He wrote about it with embarrassment, not pride. He told Father Benedetto of San Marco in Lamis in a letter dated October 22nd, 1918. "I am confused and filled with shame, for I have been made a spectacle before all, before the eyes of God and before the eyes of men." The wounds remained open, bleeding and medically documented for exactly 50 years, until September 23rd, 1968, the day he died, when they closed without scar tissue, a phenomenon noted in the medical report filed by his physician, Dr. Giorgio Festa, and preserved in the friary archives at San Giovanni Rotondo, but the confessional. That is where the real story lived. When Padre Pio returned permanently to San Giovanni Rotondo in 1916, the town in the Gargano Peninsula, built on a ridge above the Adriatic Plain at roughly 559 meters above sea level, the friary had fewer than a dozen friars and served a local population of about 10,000. Within a decade, pilgrims were arriving by the thousands. By the 1940s, an estimated 1 million people per year were traveling to San Giovanni Rotondo, specifically to attend his Mass or go to his confessional. The roads were unpaved. People slept outside. They waited days. One recorded case from 1953 documents a man who waited 11 days in line for a confession that lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes. And he said it changed his life entirely. What was it Padre Pio saw in the confessional that other priests did not? Father Joseph Pius Martin, an American friar who lived at San Giovanni Rotondo from 1960 until after Padre Pio's death, recorded this in his testimonies. He could read souls. He knew what you had done before you said a word. But more than that, he knew what had happened to your heart. He could see the exact moment when love had cooled, and he could see it long before the person themselves admitted it. This is the part that almost no one talks about. Padre Pio was not primarily interested in cataloging sins. He was interested in the root. And the root, in the majority of cases he encountered, was this. Daily life had replaced the fire of first love. He used the phrase primo amore, first love, repeatedly in his letters and in recorded conversations. He borrowed it directly from the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 4, where the risen Christ speaks to the church of Ephesus. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Padre Pio considered that verse one of the most terrifying lines in all of Scripture, not because it described apostasy, but because it described normalcy. The church at Ephesus in that text was not a corrupt church. It was a busy, doctrinally precise, morally disciplined church. It was doing everything right, and it had still lost the one thing that mattered: warm, cold, gone. Padre Pio saw this pattern in people who had been faithfully attending Mass for 20 years. He saw it in mothers who prayed the rosary every day, but had lost the interior tenderness that once accompanied it. He saw it in priests who celebrated the sacraments with technical precision, but whose hearts had gone somewhere else long before. In a letter to his spiritual daughter, Rafaelina Carras, written on May 26, 1914, he described what he called the great spiritual tragedy of good people, the transformation of living devotion into mechanical practice. There are souls who carry out all the exterior acts of piety with great exactitude, and yet within them there is nothing but ashes. They have kept the form but lost the fire. And what is most frightening is that they do not know it. Rafaelina received that letter in Naples. She was dying of a spinal illness. She preserved it. She died on September 25, 1916, and Padre Pio later said that at the moment of her death, he had seen her soul rise like a flame. He said it in exactly those words, come una fiamma, like a flame. The contrast was not accidental. She had kept her fire. Most people, he believed, did not, and the reason was almost never a dramatic choice. Think about your own life for 1 second. When did you last feel that first love intensity toward God? Not obligation, not habit, not the comfortable routine of someone who has been faithful for years. That burning thing, that sense that nothing else mattered as much as this. For most people, there is a specific period they can name. A retreat, a conversion, a moment of grace in a particular chapel in a particular year. And then there is the long after, where life, in its absolute generosity of demands, simply kept arriving. The demands are real. Padre Pio never dismissed them. In his letters to married men and women, to workers, to parents of young children, he did not demand the life of a friar. He was not naive about what daily life asked of ordinary people, but he drew a very specific line between the person who was genuinely busy and the person who had used busyness as a slow permission slip to stop investing in the interior life. The word he used repeatedly, drawn from classical spiritual theology, was tiepidezza, tepidity, lukewarmness. He considered it far more dangerous than cold indifference, because cold indifference at least knows what it is. Tepidity is warm enough to feel comfortable and cold enough to be dying. He traced the process in a letter to another spiritual daughter, Maria Gargani, written from San Giovanni Rotondo on February 14, 1919. He described it in 7 stages, though he did not number them. That structure comes from Friar Gerardo di Flumeri's analysis in his 1985 academic study, La direzione spirituale in Padre Pio da Pietrelcina, published in the journal Aspernas by the Pontifical Faculty of Theology of Southern Italy in Naples. Di Flumeri spent 8 years reading Padre Pio's correspondence and identified these recurring stages across hundreds of letters. First, a person begins with genuine spiritual fervor. Prayer is alive. The sacraments feel real. There is an interior joy. Second, life intensifies. Children, work, illness, financial pressure, relational conflict, time shrinks. Third, the person begins substituting quality for quantity in prayer. Instead of a living conversation with God, they settle for checking the box. Mass attended, rosary recited, done. Fourth, the interior silence deepens. Not the good kind, the disconnected kind. Prayer starts to feel like talking to a wall. Fifth, The person assumes this feeling means they have done something wrong, or that God has withdrawn, and rather than pressing through, they quietly reduce expectations. Sixth, they build a theology of accommodation. They tell themselves that mature faith is less emotional, that the early fervor was for beginners, that what they have now is adult faith. Seventh, the fire is out, and they have constructed a completely reasonable explanation for why that is not only acceptable, but actually a sign of spiritual growth. Padre Pio said the seventh stage was the one that broke his heart in the confessional. Not the person weeping with shame over a serious sin, the person who came in calm, organized, and quietly proud of the stable, low-temperature version of faith they had curated over decades. He wrote in a letter to Father Agostino in 1916, "I fear the cold soul far more than the sinful one. The sinful soul knows it is far from God, and therefore still reaches. The cold soul believes it is close and no longer moves." And there is a particular kind of person who arrives at that seventh stage faster than anyone else. Not the reckless person, not the one who lived dangerously or loved carelessly, the conscientious one, the responsible one, the person who took every obligation seriously, to family, to work, to community, to church, and in the act of carrying all of it faithfully, dropped the interior life somewhere along the road without noticing, because at least the exterior was still intact. Padre Pio saw these people constantly. They were, by every visible measure, the best people in the room, and inside, by the measurement that mattered most to him, they were in crisis. He said to a group of his spiritual children gathered in the friary garden at San Giovanni Rotondo in the summer of 1960, in a conversation recorded by Father Eusebio Notte, and later included in the collected testimonies for the beatification cause, "The devil does not need to destroy the good person. He only needs to keep them busy. Busy is enough. Busy is the slow way of starving a soul while it continues to appear well-fed." That word, starving. He used the Italian affamato in the original, and the witnesses who transcribed the conversation noted that he paused after it for nearly 10 seconds, which they said was unusual for him. He almost never paused. He spoke fast, directly, and moved on. That pause told them he was thinking about someone specific, maybe many someones, maybe everyone he had seen that week in the confessional. Now here is where the documented cases become something you cannot look away from. In the testimonies compiled for the beatification cause, the Positio Super Virtutibus submitted to Rome in 1997, there are sworn statements from dozens of people who came to Padre Pio's confessional and reported an experience that can only be described as surgical. He did not ask them to describe their sins. He named them first. But more than that, he identified the specific year and specific circumstance in which their relationship with God had begun to cool. One testimony, given under oath by a woman identified in the Positio only as MG from the Diocese of Bari, states that when she sat in the confessional in 1957, she'd not been to Mass regularly for several years, but considered herself a person of faith. She had reasons. She was raising 4 children alone after her husband's death in 1952. She was working 2 jobs. She was exhausted. She had made peace with a reduced practice of faith. When Padre Pio turned to her and spoke, he said, and she quotes this directly in her sworn testimony, "You know when you stopped. It was not when your husband died. It was 3 months before he died, when you decided that God was not listening to you anymore. That is when the door closed." She had never told anyone that. She had barely admitted it to herself. The decision to stop trusting God's active involvement in her life had come in a single evening in 1952, sitting in a kitchen in Bari, when she prayed for her husband's recovery and felt nothing. 3 months later, he died. She had carried the conclusion silently ever since, that God had not answered, therefore God was not there, and her entire theology of consolation had been built on that wound. Padre Pio named it, specifically, with a year. She returned to the sacraments that day. She testified to this 30 years later in 1987 as part of the formal investigation. She was 81 years old at the time of her testimony. If you are finding this story valuable, subscribe right now. It genuinely helps this channel continue. Tell us in the comments what city you are in, and know that this material is not drawn from popular retellings. This comes directly from the Epistolario, Padre Pio's own letters in 4 volumes, and from the sworn depositions of the Positio Super Virtutibus. These are primary documents, legal records, sworn testimonies, not legends. Now, back to the story. The question Padre Pio kept returning to in his spiritual direction was not simply, what happened, but what do you do now? And here his approach was both radical and extremely specific. He did not prescribe a general return to piety. He prescribed a return to the exact moment the fire went out, and a deliberate decision to re-enter it. This is a concept in Catholic spiritual theology called renovation of the first conversion, and it appears in the writings of Saint Francis de Sales, specifically in his Introduction to the Devout Life, published in 1609 in Lyon, France. De Sales describes it in Part 4, Chapter 14, as the practice of returning to the original fervor of one's spiritual beginning, not as nostalgia, but as a living act of the will. Padre Pio had read de Sales deeply. He recommended the Introduction to the Devout Life in his letters more than any other spiritual text except Scripture itself. The book appears by name in at least 23 of his letters in the Epistolario. But Padre Pio added something to de Sales' framework that was distinctly his own. He insisted that the renovation was not a feeling to be recovered, but a decision to be made in the absence of feeling. This is crucial. He was not asking people to manufacture emotion. He was asking them to act first and trust that the fire would follow the action, not the reverse. He wrote this explicitly in a letter to Antonietta Vona, dated March 8, 1922, from San Giovanni Rotondo. Do not wait to feel the flame before you approach the fire. You have it backwards. Approach the fire cold, approach it dry, approach it as if you feel nothing, and the flame will find you. God does not wait for your feelings to be ready. He waits for your feet to move. Those feet, that decision, the specific acts, Padre Pio prescribed what he called the little return, a term used in Father Padre Pio Spirituale, a collection of his spiritual counsel compiled by Father Fernando d'Ariese Pio X, published by the Edizioni Padre Pio da Pietrelcina in 1984. The little return consisted of 3 specific practices to be taken up immediately, not eventually, in whatever circumstances a person's daily life actually allowed. The first was fixed prayer time, not flexible, not when I have a moment. A specific time, the same time every day, that was treated with the same non-negotiable weight as a work meeting or a school pickup. It did not have to be long. Padre Pio told one factory worker from Milan, who came to him in 1953, that 10 minutes was sufficient. But those 10 minutes had to be the same 10 minutes every day, deliberately chosen, defended against interruption. The specificity was the point. He said, "A prayer that can wait for a convenient moment has already been replaced." He was adamant about this with people who complained they had no time. He did not accept the complaint. He had seen people in genuine poverty, working 6-day weeks in the fields outside San Giovanni Rotondo, who still found 10 minutes before sunrise. He had seen mothers of 7 children who kept a single candle lit on the kitchen table and sat before it for 10 minutes while the household slept. And that one act was enough to keep the connection alive across decades. The quantity was almost irrelevant. The decision was everything. The act of carving out that specific window and defending it was, in his view, a daily renewal of the original choice to love God, repeated in the same kitchen, in the same chair, in the same pre-dawn quiet, until it became the structural spine of a life, rather than an optional decoration on top of one. The second practice was what he called custody of the small moments, the practice of turning the microgaps of daily life into brief acts of interior contact with God. Not formal prayer. A word, a glance upward, a silent, "I remember you," while waiting for a kettle to boil or a train to come. He had learned this practice from the 17th century French mystic, Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, whose conversations and letters were compiled posthumously in Paris in 1692 under the title, The Practice of the Presence of God. Padre Pio referenced Brother Lawrence by name in at least 9 letters in the Epistolario. He called him that simple cook who understood more than most theologians. The third practice was what Padre Pio called the uncomfortable sacrament, meaning going to confession specifically when you do not feel you need it, not to confess dramatic sins, but to make a deliberate act of humility and contact. He believed that one of the signs of advanced tepidity was the complete disappearance of the desire for confession. A person who has not gone to confession in years and does not miss it has, in Padre Pio's framework, lost something more than a habit. They have lost the awareness of their own interior distance from God. The confession becomes the diagnostic, not just the remedy. He said in a recorded conversation with Father Clemente of Santa Maria in Punta in 1961, preserved in the testimonial archive at San Giovanni Rotondo, "When a person tells me they went to confession 6 months ago and felt nothing was missing, I'm more worried about them than the person who comes to me weeping every week. The one who weeps still feels. The one who feels nothing has a very long road ahead. Very long road. Quiet. No map." But Padre Pio was not without hope in these cases. Never. What made him remarkable was that he combined an absolute refusal to minimize the problem with an equally absolute refusal to despair about it. He told the woman from Bari in 1957, the one who had closed the door 3 months before her husband died, that the same God who had seemed silent in that kitchen in 1952 had in fact been present the entire time, and that what she had interpreted as absence was, in the spiritual framework he was working from, precisely the kind of silence described in the writings of St. John of the Cross in The Dark Night of the Soul, written in the 1580s in Segovia, Spain. John describes a phase of spiritual development in which the consolations of early faith are deliberately withdrawn so that the soul can learn to love God for God, rather than for the feelings God provides. It is not punishment. It is pedagogy. Padre Pio had lived this personally. intensely. He described periods of interior darkness in his letters that lasted months, one in particular from the autumn of 1920 to the spring of 1921, during which he wrote to Father Agostino that he could not pray, could not feel God's presence, could not access any consolation, and was functioning entirely on what he called naked faith, the decision to believe in the absence of any evidence available to feeling or emotion. He wrote on December 8th, 1920, from San Giovanni Rotondo, "I have nothing left, no warmth, no light, no sense of God's nearness. I continue because I promised to continue. That is all I have, but I am told that this is enough. That is enough. That cold, dry decision to keep moving, that is what he preached to the tepid soul. Not a return to the emotional intensity of early conversion, not a manufactured fervor, simply the decision to keep walking toward a fire you cannot currently see or feel." The documented results of this kind of counsel are scattered throughout the testimonies. One case that appears in the Positio involves a priest from the Archdiocese of Naples, referred to as Don A.M., who came to San Giovanni Rotondo in 1963, 5 years before Padre Pio's death. He had been a priest for 22 years. He celebrated Mass daily. He prayed the Liturgy of the Hours faithfully. By every external measure, he was a good priest. But in his deposition, made in 1994, 31 years after the event, he stated that when Padre Pio received him in the confessional, he said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he said, "You became a priest for God. When did you start being a priest for the institution?" Don A.M. testified that the question hit him like a physical blow. He had not been able to articulate it himself, but the moment Padre Pio said it, he recognized it completely. Somewhere in the middle of the 1950s, he placed it around 1956 or 1957, when a painful dispute with his bishop over a parish assignment had left him disillusioned. He had stopped thinking of his priesthood as a relationship with Christ and had begun thinking of it as a job he performed for a structure he was increasingly skeptical of. He still believed in God. He still prayed. But the first love, the thing that had driven him to the seminary at age 17 in 1941, the thing that had made ordination on June 29, 1941, in Naples the best day of his life, that thing was gone, replaced by professional competence and institutional duty. Padre Pio sent him away with 3 instructions. First, go back to the specific moment the shift happened and confess the resentment that drove it, not just as a general failing, but as a specific event with a specific person, the bishop, and a specific decision. Second, find one person in your parish whose faith is still alive and spend time near them, not to teach them, but to be near the fire they are carrying. Third, say 1 Mass per week for the next 3 months, specifically for the intention of recovering your first love, naming that intention explicitly at the offertory, like placing a specific request on an altar. Don A.M. followed all 3. In his testimony from 1994, he states, "Within 90 days, something had changed. I cannot explain it in theological terms. I can only say that when I stood at the altar on the morning of the 90th day, I wept during the consecration for the first time in perhaps 15 years. Not from sadness, from recognition. Something that had been gone came back. 90 days. The same altar. A completely different man standing at it. This is why Padre Pio's counsel on tepidity is not simply a matter of religious devotion. It is a precise, documented, historically attested account of what happens to the human interior when the deepest source of meaning in a person's life is slowly replaced by functional, competent, hollow repetition. The specific danger he identified, and this is where his observations cut across every background and belief, is that the hollow version is almost indistinguishable from the real one from the outside. The person still shows up, still performs, still says the right words, and the interior silence grows without anyone noticing, including the person themselves. He wrote in a letter to Maria Gargani in June of 1923, "The greatest mercy I can offer a tepid soul is to refuse to let them be comfortable in it. Not because I am cruel, but because a soul that goes to sleep in the cold does not feel how cold it is. And the one who refuses to shake it awake bears a terrible responsibility. Terrible responsibility. Cold? Awake." Padre Pio himself lived under enormous external pressure that could easily have produced tepidity of a different kind, the kind born not of comfort, but of exhaustion and persecution. From 1923 to 1933, the Holy Office in Rome imposed restrictions on his ministry under the authority of Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val, and later under investigation by a commissioner, Father Roberto Padre Briccarelli, a Jesuit. During this 10-year period, Padre Pio was forbidden to celebrate public Mass, forbidden from corresponding publicly with spiritual daughters, and effectively placed under a form of internal exile within his own friary. He was not permitted to use his stigmatized hands for the sacraments in any public way. The restrictions were humiliating, unjust, as later Vatican evaluation confirmed, and they came from the institution he had given his life to serve. His letters during this period, written in secret to Father Agostino, show a man fighting for his interior life with the same discipline he demanded of everyone else. In a letter from 1926, in the middle of the most restrictive phase, "I have no access to the things God gave me to do. I am reduced to waiting, but I refuse to let this waiting become a death. I will keep the fire lit with whatever wood remains." Whatever wood remains. That sentence. He came out of the decade of restriction in 1933 with the fire not only intact, but intensified. The restrictions were lifted after an independent medical investigation in Rome confirmed the unexplained nature of his wounds, and a new evaluation of his ministry concluded the earlier investigation had been based on faulty and, in some cases, fabricated reports. He returned to the confessional at San Giovanni Rotondo. The lines formed again, longer than before. By 1956, the year the construction of his Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza hospital was completed, a project he had personally initiated in 1925, financed by post-war donations from across Europe and the United States, totaling over 500 million lire in the final construction budget. San Giovanni Rotondo had become the second most visited pilgrimage site in Italy after Rome itself. The friary received an average of 8,000 letters per month from people seeking his counsel, according to the records preserved in the friary archive, now digitized and held at the Fondazione Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza. 8,000 letters a month. From people who had felt something cooling inside them and were reaching out toward the nearest fire they could find. He died on September 23, 1968. He had celebrated Mass that morning at 5 a.m, the earliest Mass of the day, before the crowds arrived, in a state that witnesses described as barely ambulatory. He had been visibly ill for weeks. He died in his cell at 2:20 in the morning. His last recorded words, spoken to the friars present, were, "Jesu Maria," Jesus, Mary. He was 81 years old. He had spent 50 years bearing wounds that no medical science was able to explain, and the morning after his death every wound was closed. Not scarred, closed, as if they had never been there. Dr. Giuseppe Sala, present at the examination of the body, documented this in a notarized report filed with the friary. The report is still held at San Giovanni Rotondo. But here's the thing that rewrites everything we have just heard. In 1999, during the examination of his remains in preparation for beatification, he was beatified by Pope John Paul II on May 2, 1999, the examining physicians found something in the tissue of his hands, under the area where the stigmata had been, not scars, not marks, literally nothing. The tissue was indistinguishable from hands that had never been wounded, not healed tissue with no memory of wound at all. This was reported by the presiding physician, Dr. Cataldo Lombardi, in a document submitted to the Vatican Postulation and quoted in Alberto Del Fonte's full forensic summary published in the Italian journal Medicina e Morale in 2001. The man who spent 5 decades telling people that the fire does not die when it feels like it has gone out, whose own interior life survived 10 years of institutional suppression and decades of physical suffering that no medical science could explain or stop, left behind hands that the examining doctor said showed no evidence of what everyone had seen with their own eyes for 50 years. The wound was real. And then it was gone, as if the only thing that had ever been there was the love that caused it.